This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good evening, Rabbi. We're at the closing moments of Tzom Gedalia, and we spoke a little bit about it this morning. So we want to propose another explanation for the day of Tzom Gedalia, which is the day that Gedalia was murdered. He was murdered by a Yid by the name of Yishmael. I don't know what his parents were thinking, but that's what they named him. By the bris, the father got confused between the news and the name, so he called him Yishmael. But that was his name. Now, the question we want to think about is, Tzom Gedalia seemingly has nothing to do with Asar Simei Teshuvah, right? We mentioned this morning, Asar B'Teves is the day they surrounded the walls of Yerushalayim. Shivas B'Tammuz they broke through. Teshuvah they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And Tzom Gedalia, the Rambam says Gedalia was the last hope, the last coal, the last remnant that remained in Eretz Yisrael. And when he was murdered, the last ember extinguished. Fine. So that all has to do with Churban Beis HaMikdash. That's part of a different part of the year. What's it doing in the middle of the Asar Simei Teshuvah? That's what we discussed this morning, and this morning we offered one possibility. The Marsha, Masechta Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Amud Beis, says something very important. And that is, you have to know the history, you have to know a little Navi. Even though we're a non-for-profit organization, nevertheless, you need to know about what was going on in the Nevi'im. Well, first of all, the majority of the Jewish people were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah? No. Nebuchadnezzar. And this is the end of Bayis Rishon. And Sancher was 100 years earlier. And of the Jews who were there by the Churban were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. But he left. And at that point, the Jews were out. Most of the Jews were out. But he made a law that he's going to allow a Jewish governor to govern Eretz Yisrael, whereupon a lot of Jews began to return from Moav. And now, the Moavim, they swallowed it. Ammon couldn't take it. So Ammon hired the hitman, Yishmael, to go kill Gedalia. So says the Marsha, so we think this is part of Churban Beis HaMikdash. No, this is an Asar Simei Teshuvah fast. Why? Because here Yishmael, he's been sitting the last 2 days in shul. He heard the tefillas, he heard the shabbos, he heard the musaf, he heard the drashas. He's sitting there the whole day in shul. You can't go through a Rosh Hashanah without thinking a little bit, I need to be better. How could a Yid go through a Rosh Hashanah without thinking, I got to change? And the next day he goes and he kills a tzaddik. Says the Marsha, we don't commemorate every time a tzaddik is murdered. And there are a lot of tzaddikim who were murdered. Yeshaya, Zechariah. Zechariah was greater than Gedalia. Yeshaya was greater than Gedalia. Why don't we commemorate their death? The answer is, this is not an isolated murder. It's the fact that a Jew could go through a Rosh Hashanah, and after that, look what he did. It's the tragedy. You know what Tzom Gedalia is? The tragedy of not taking advantage of Rosh Hashanah. That's what it is.
What was the reason of killing him?
Because he was hired for money. People do anything. Right? He was hired. That's what he did for a living. He killed people. He was an exterminator. He killed people. Right? He was hired. Ammon did not want the Jews to rebuild in Israel, so they hired him to knock off their leader. It was a political move. But the fact that we're commemorating something that we would think is relevant to the Churban, Emil Asar Simei Teshuvah, you have to know it's connected to Rosh Hashanah. In other words, Marsha says the fact that it could happen during Asar Simei Teshuvah means, look what could happen to a person. A person could be so inspired, he could go through a Rosh Hashanah, he could be sitting there in the shul, he puts the talis over his head, he's crying, he has all these big kabbalas for the next year, and the next day he goes and kills. That's the biggest tragedy in the world. So Tzom Gedalia is very intimately connected to Rosh Hashanah. In other words, it's the tragedy of not taking advantage of Rosh Hashanah. That's what the Marsha says.
Yeah, and he was in the base Mikdash.
With some editorial additions. What?
He was in the base Mikdash.
No. That was a different time. That was Zechariah. Okay. Now, I saw a little bit of an elaboration on this Marsha, and that is, why was it so important? Now, first of all, the Navi told the Jews, that they should return to Eretz Yisrael. That some Jews should return to Eretz Yisrael. When Gedalia was killed, everybody left Eretz Yisrael, even though Yirmiyah told them to stay. Yirmiyah said, despite the fact your leader is murdered, you need to stay. The Jews left. Why was it so important that the Jews stay in Eretz Yisrael? The Beis HaMikdash is gone. So now you're 70 years without a Beis HaMikdash. It matters if Jews are in Israel, not in Israel. Why was it so important that Jews remain in Israel? No, you need Rov Yisrael Ala and Mosam, right? Yeah, but they still couldn't do it. They still couldn't do it. They didn't have Bezdin. They just had a small remnant. What benefit was it? So it's suggested that we know when the second Beis HaMikdash was built, it was not a real binyan. First of all, it was missing 5 things that the first Beis HaMikdash had. It didn't have the Arayin, didn't have the Eish, it didn't have the Urim V'Tumim, didn't have the Shechina, didn't have Ruach HaKodesh. Right? There's an easy way to remember that. Asher, the word Asher, like Usher. I think of Usher, and then I remember the 5 things but Usher is only 1 aleph. No, this Usher has 3 alephs. So you remember, Usher with 3 alephs is Eish, Urim V'Tumim, Arayin, Shechina, Ruach HaKodesh. You think of Usher and then you remember it. It's very simple, right? So anyway, so the second Beis HaMikdash, by the way, did not have even Shechina. It was not the real thing. The second Beis HaMikdash, there was no presence of God. Had the Jews remained in Eretz Yisrael between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, it's very possible, there would have been no hefsek, no interruption between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, and then Bayis Sheni would have achieved the same level as Bayis Rishon. Same way, here you have a Rosh Hashanah and you have a Yom Kippur, but you can't be mafsek in between. You can't interrupt in between. If you interrupt in between, then you could have a Tzom Gedalia. Tzom Gedalia is the reminder not to allow an interruption. The same way, what happened because of Gedalia? There was a hefsek between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, but that came about because there was a hefsek between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You can't interrupt, you can't pause. Whatever levels, whatever kabbalas, whatever achievements you've made on Rosh Hashanah, don't allow them to wane during the intermediate days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
But the 5 things that you mentioned were put in the Mizrah 100 years before it got destroyed.
According to one opinion, according to the Bavli, according to Yishalmi, the Arayin, and the Gemara in Harias, Gabi knows Harias, it says that there's another opinion that it was brought to Bavel, so maybe they would have got it back. In other words, the interruption, what?
Even if it brought, still there was lack of.
In other words, there was a lack of Shechina, but why? Because everything faded, and in the 70 years in between, everything was lost. But maybe had the Jews remained there, they would have been able to hold on to it. In other words,
you need 21 or more in order to keep the Shekhinah?
Different levels of Shechina. You have 10.
They did have people. When Ezra came back in Nechem, he started saying, "You intermarried." He wanted to bring it back to the thing. So in other words, 70 years was a long time. But
Ezra and Nehemiah came back 52 years. They came back 52 years. But in the they came back and Ezra Allah Mibavel with many Jews. But
it wasn't never empty all the Jews. It was still.
It was empty.
Maybe it was a little
when Gedalia was killed, it was empty and completely. Chazal say it was empty for a certain period of time. There was nobody there.
Nobody?
There's a certain period of time. Okay.
Yud Marayin, right?
There's another thought about Tzom Gedalia and what it has to do with Rosh Hashanah. And this is a pshat that David Richter is going to like. It says in Mishlei, Al titztak harbe. Don't be too big of a tzaddik. No, not because of that. Now, Al titztak harbe. Don't be too big. What does that mean? Don't be too big a tzaddik. Because I'll say, Lo yama oretz chassid. If you don't know Torah, you can't be righteous. Here you have a guy. He sits with his talis over his head, and he's saying Tehillim the whole day. But he doesn't know halacha. He doesn't know yes, no, whether you're allowed to do or not to. So you could have the best intentions, and you could be very genuine, and you could be very sincere, but sincerity is not enough. Imein Yira ein Chachma ve'ein Chachma ein Yira. You need two things. You need Yira Shamayim, but you also need to be a Chacham. You have to know Halacha, you have to know Torah. You also have to know when to be a tzaddik and when not to be a tzaddik. Here you have Gedalia. Gedalia got a news bulletin that a man by the name of Shmuel ben Elisha is coming to kill him. So what should he have done? He should have called the Secret Service and get a bodyguard. But he said, no, I don't want to be Makabel Lashon Hara. So he didn't take any precautions. And Yishmael came, and Gedalia gave him a big hug, and Yishmael killed him.
What happened to Yishmael after that?
What happened to him?
Yeah, big check.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe somebody called
He got
up.
paid off. And he's in the museum of the wax museum of famous criminals.
Of Ganem.
So
Big Ganem.
Then there was a
you could
chance.
go through Rosh Hashanah and you could put your talis over your head and you could cry the whole day, and you could think you're a big tzaddik, but that's not. But you got to be a chacham also. You got to know halacha. Gedalia was a big tzaddik, but he didn't know the halacha that if someone tells you lashon hara, you're not allowed to be makabelet, but you're allowed to suspect. So he should have said, okay, I don't believe Yishmael is going to kill me, but maybe he will, so I'm going to hire a bodyguard. But he didn't do that. He was titzdak harbe. So perhaps the following Rosh Hashanah, your day, you're sitting in shul, you make all your kabbalas, but you got to know what the halacha is. It's not enough to be God-fearing and righteous. You also have to be smart, and you have to know the halacha. Lo yama oretz chassid. You could want to do the right thing. You could want to keep Shabbos, but if you don't know Hilchos Boira, you're not going to know how to take socks out of your drawer on Shabbos. And if you don't know Hilchos Dash and Mefarek, you're not going to know how to make egg salad and tuna fish and avocado. Yeah, you could sit at your table and you could sing Zmiros, and you could sing Ka'echsoif, and you could sing all the holy songs, but you're not going to know how to make egg salad on Shabbos. You're not going to know how to make avocado. You're not going to know how to make tuna fish. You're not going to know how to make salad. So you could want to be holy, but you also have to know what to do. So maybe following Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia is a lesson that coupled with the Yira Shamayim, you also need Chachma.
But we didn't learn the lesson because by the second Beis HaMikdash, I forgot his name, that didn't want to let the cow go through the carbon or something.
Zechai ben Akuas.
Right.
I hear.
And so we didn't learn the lessons. Only
right. I hear.
he was, because they said he was a nanav or whatever.
An v'stanusa shav Zechai ben Akuas hechviva es beitena. Okay, so Rabbi said that is a word on Tzom Gedalia.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.